Welcome. We are delighted to have with us today an absolutely eminently qualified expert on Russia and Eurasia to talk to us about the horrific humanitarian crisis in Ukraine and what Putin is doing to that country. Before we begin, I have a very, very, very important public service announcement. It has come to my attention that the negotiating team in Vienna is about to broker a deal with the Islamic Republic of Iran, where there will be wholesale concessions that might endanger the national security interests of the United States and our allies, including Israel. This comes from Gabriel Nerona, who was a former high-ranking State Department official who said that, quote, his former State Department, National Security Council, and European Union colleagues are so concerned with the concessions being made by Robert Malley and his team in Vienna that they've allowed me to publish some of the details of the coming deal in the hopes that Congress will act to stop this capitulation. I have written an action alert. So if anybody has any questions, please go ahead and call me at 202-601-7422. And we've also put together a press release that we sent out yesterday, but this is from a highly credible source, and apparently this deal is imminent, and it might come as soon as this coming Monday. And they are planning to offer a $7 billion signing bonus, and they're going to take important sanctions off of some 112 of the regime's worst terrorists, including leading officials of the IRGC. So it's incredibly important that all of you read the action alert. And if you haven't gotten it, please call us at 202-601-7422. We have all the information laid out for you there. Now, getting back to the program at hand, as you know, there is a huge humanitarian crisis right now going on in Ukraine. At this point, there are about 1 million refugees. Russia has laid siege to at least one city, and we are in tremendous hands to be able to inform us exactly what's going on. Dr. Stephen Blank is an internationally recognized expert on Russian foreign and defense policies and an international relations expert from the across the former Soviet Union. He's also a leading expert on European and Asian security, including energy issues. Since 2020, Stephen has been a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. In 2020 and 2021, he was also a senior expert for Russia at the U.S. Institute for Peace. From 2013 to 2020, he was a senior fellow at the American Foreign Policy Council. He also has been a professor of Russian national security studies at the Strategic Studies Institute of the U.S. Army War College in Pennsylvania. Professor Blank has been professor of national security affairs at the Strategic Studies Institute since 1989. In 1998 to 2001, he was a Douglas MacArthur Professor of Research at the War College. Professor Blank has consulted for the CIA, major think tanks and foundations, chaired major international conferences in the USA and abroad in Florence, Prague, and London, and has been a commentator on foreign affairs in the media in the United States and abroad. He has also advised major corporations on investments in Russia and is a consultant for the Gerson Lehrmann Group. And he has published over 1,300 articles and monographs on the former Soviet Union and Russia, US, Asian, and European military and foreign policies, including publishing or editing 15 books. He's testified before Congress on Russia, China, and Central Asia. And he has appeared on CNN, BBC, Deutsche Welle, CNBC Asia, and is a regular guest on The Voice of America. So we are extremely delighted to have with us a preeminent scholar and a wonderful friend, Dr. Stephen Blank. So Steve, tell us about the latest situation to date as it stands today for Ukraine.
Thank you, Sarah. I mean, in a word, the situation is grim. I mean, without any equivocations. I'd like to thank you for inviting me. It turns out that one of the people listening actually went to high school with me. So it's an opportunity for a reunion. I'm going to answer the questions you posed to me in an earlier email, and then we'll open it up to questions and answers. And in the course of my presentation, I think I can explain to people why it's grim. I think if you're just watching television, whether it's CNN, BBC, or any other network, you'll see right away why I say that. But first of all, I was asked a series of questions by Sarah. We're going to go through those questions and then take yours. First of all, Sarah asked me, what are Putin's objectives? Now, we can break those objectives down into three categories: the personal, the imperial or institutional objectives as they relate to Russia and Russian history, and right up to this point, and political or geopolitical and strategic issues. Personal, and one other point, they're all intertwined. There's no way you can, at least analytically, pull one out of the other and say it's only that and not this. They all come together as in any major political or strategic event. First of all, the personal. Mr. Putin is haunted by his mortality. Now, that's true for most of us who are his age, and I confess he's only 2 years younger than me. But this seems to be an obsession on his part. I'm not going to go into the details, lack of time. I can add to that if anybody wants. But he is determined to leave his personal mark in Russian history as one of the great leaders of Russia and as a man who, to use the Russian phrase, regathered Russian lands. And it is an article of faith among Putin and therefore the entire government that Ukraine is Russia. Indeed, the ambassador to Serbia today on the Euraktiv website, it's an EU website, gave an interview where he said, first of all, we're not occupying anybody. Second, we're fighting in our own land. This will come as a great surprise to people that, Ukraine is not Russia. But nevertheless, Putin is obsessed with the idea Ukraine is Russia, that it was stolen from Russia, and that it's the United States and NATO that are behind everything. Therefore, anything, and furthermore, he is completely convinced, as is the elite, and this is a long-standing Russian trope, that the West is out to get us. As a matter of fact, Putin, and I emphasize this, Putin and his team have been at war with the West, although not in the kinetic sense, because they understand who is the superior military power, since 2004, 2005, when they first tried to take over Ukraine and failed. Immediately, they blamed this on the CIA and on the United States and on foreign agents. They have no concept that anything happens in an autonomous sense in politics. It's all conspiracies because that's what their life is and what their life experience has been. And therefore, we're at war with them because they're trying to deny Russia its God-given or foreordained right to be a great power, i.e. empire. As any student of history knows, empire means the center monopolizes sovereignty and power. Everybody else's power is diminished. To go back in Russian history, it's a kind of, we're going to apply the Brezhnev doctrine of the 1960s to the present, i.e. Russia, Soviet Union, Moscow has unlimited sovereignty. Everybody else has to do as they're told. A very classic idea of empire, but one that is ingrained in the Russian soul. And I am not saying something strange here, because it gets into the imperial ideology, as I said. It is an article of faith to Russian imperialism that Ukraine is part of Russia and that Russia must be an empire. The great Russian-American historian George Vernadsky said that Russian liberalism ended at the borders with Ukraine because of this obsession with empire. And if you have the misfortune, as I do, to have to read, for professional reasons, Russian foreign policy commentary, they all end up saying one way or another that Ukraine is really Russia and that Ukraine sovereignty must be diminished. Furthermore, every Russian official and ambassador who has ever had to comment on things like this since the 1990s, that is, since the end of the Cold War and the end of the Soviet Union, and the signature of a raft of solemn international treaties guaranteeing the post-Cold War status quo, has refused to accept that the sovereignty and territorial integrity of any East European or post-Soviet state is inviolate, despite all those treaties. So in other words, if they win in Ukraine, although I don't think they can, if they win in Ukraine, there is nothing stopping them from immediately launching new pressures elsewhere. And as we all know, they have been at war with the West and the United States through subversion, corruption, cyber war, and so on for the last 18 years. Finally, third, politically, geostrategically, this is the only way Russia can be a great power. There's a famous line by Zbigniew Brzezinski that Russia cannot be an empire unless it possesses Ukraine. They certainly believe that as well. Furthermore, they are convinced that Ukraine is building nuclear weapons, which is utter fantasy, that NATO enlargement is a threat to Russia when it is no way in form a threat to Russia. It is a threat to Mr. Putin, because the threat that Ukraine poses is that, A, by being independent, it repudiates the whole Muscovite narrative of Russian history, that Moscow is the foreordained leader of Russian history and exponent and champion thereof. Second, and more importantly, democracy in Ukraine is anathema, not too strong a word in this context, is anathema to the Russian government, because the Russian government, to draw an analogy, is a mafia. It's a mafia-like state. And if you're, first principle I always used to teach students, if you want to understand this state, you have to understand the way it thinks and appreciate that from the inside. And we're going to try to do some of that today. But as it turned out, there was another guy who was teaching the same thing to his children. His name was Vito Corleone in the movie. And there is a parallel. I'm not trying to be facetious, but it's easier for people who've either read the novel or seen the movies to understand that we're dealing with people who think that they are empowered by God, never get enough respect, and therefore want honor at all costs, and are not beholden by any moral calculus. Okay? Second question, the Russian domestic situation. Now, it is very encouraging that there are thousands of people, and there are thousands of people who've actually gone out in the streets at great risk to themselves in Russia protesting this war. But they alone are not going to bring it to an end. What is necessary is that the West respond much more boldly than it has up to date, much more imaginatively and creatively, and keep that pressure on so that it becomes clear that the Russian government cannot, under any circumstances, win this war. That's a very tall order, as I think you'll see. Only then will the Russian state begin to crack, because it is an axiom of Russian history going back really to Ivan the Terrible, if not earlier, that protracted war puts the Russian autocracy to the supreme test. And Russia's greatest leaders have understood this. And for that reason, all try to avoid protracted wars. They're not afraid of war as such, as long as they think they're going to win. But they certainly don't want a protracted war. And we've seen that even in our own time, where Afghanistan in 1979 to 89 was instrumental in causing the collapse of the Soviet Union, as was the Cold War, which was thankfully not militarily engaged, but a surrogate for that. As a result, we need to make sure that this war goes on. And the Ukrainian people will resist. What's going on now is that Putin is trying to destroy the country. It's classic Russian military strategy to depopulate, force refugees out of a country, occupy it, kill everybody in the elite, terrorize the place. Grozny 96 or 2000 is another example of that. To give you what we've seen in Syria, if you look at Russian military operations in Syria, which are very similar, unfortunately. There also needs to be not only enhancement of military, diplomatic, and economic pressure, but to conclude that quadruple element, which the U.S. military calls the dime: diplomacy, information, military, and economic instruments of power. There needs to be a much bolder and sustained information campaign inside Russia against Putin. Putin is trying to close the country down. We have to thwart that by any possible means. And to be frank with you, I and a bunch of other people have been demanding this for 20 or more years. We've gotten absolutely nowhere. Putin's behavior now is not something new, but we have finally got an opportunity to get, Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, and the Board of International Broadcasting to figure out that information warfare is Putin's game and that we have to beat him at it, as we did in the run-up to the actual invasion. Third, the nuclear threat. Nuclear threats are part and parcel of Russian strategy for a variety of reasons. One, because they have nuclear weapons, it makes them feel like a great power. To paraphrase Henry Kissinger, nuclear weapons are the ultimate aphrodisiac for the Russians. It makes them feel like their manhood is fully engaged here. They also believe that since it's a mafia-like state and an intimidation culture, that nuclear weapons will and have, to be fair, have intimidated Europe a great deal over the years, going back to the Suez Crisis, 1956. It should be instructive to people that Khrushchev's threats at that time, and they're the same kinds of threats Putin's making now, of nuclear weapons were directed at England and France, whom he knew would be terrified. They weren't directed at Israel. That's an interesting point. Now, the further issue of nuclear use here is that the threats that Putin has made, although nothing has followed up since then, correspond fully to Russian strategy and doctrine. Russian doctrine states that the nuclear weapon will be used if the state's existence is at risk. And since any war in which the Russian state enters into puts the state at risk, nuclear weapons can be used if the state is in trouble. And what here we see is a perfect example of that, a paradigm, if you like. The Russian government plan for Ukraine went awry, mainly due to Russian mismanagement on a grand scale. They're going to have to fight a much longer and protracted war. They are very afraid of NATO intervention. And to deter NATO, they are raising the nuclear threat and to intimidate Ukraine into surrender, because they're perfectly capable of using what we call a low-yield nuclear weapon or a tactical nuclear weapon. They're not the same thing, in order to decimate Ukraine. Or they could actually use crack the sarcophagus at Chernobyl, which they've conquered, and open that up as a source of radiation across the country. So the nuclear threat is an attempt to win wars that they start or that are forced upon them and of course all wars are forced upon Moscow in its view, that they cannot prevail quickly and successfully enough by purely conventional means. Therefore, the nuclear threat is invoked. And if the sound American and Western strategy would deprive them of that effort to dominate the escalation ladder that experts talk about with regard to nuclear weapons. Lastly, the willingness of Russia to use nuclear weapons means they have no qualms about genocide. They've already perpetrated several genocides under the Soviets. If you read Tim Snyder's book, Bloodlands, and Norman Naimark's book on Stalin's genocides of various peoples in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, the Ukraine was among them by what the Ukrainians call the Holodomor, the Hunger War, during collectivization under Stalin. They're perfectly capable of doing it again if they think their interests demand it. Furthermore, will Putin be stopped? not if he wins. Now, I don't think he can win for reasons I'm going to go into, but there's a famous quote from Catherine the Great. She was Tsarina from 1762 and 1796, and as one of my teachers said, with apologies to the feminists here, she had a fundamentally masculine view of power. I can only defend my frontiers by expanding them. That is just as true today as it was in the 18th century. So if somehow they prevail and win in Ukraine, and at ruinous cost, all the efforts to subvert their neighbors and threaten them will continue without interruption. And their pace will be governed by merely considerations of expediency. Allied involvement. Militarily, the Biden administration has ruled out no-fly zones on the danger that they're going to lead the war with Russia. There are other alternatives. We can get into those in Q&A because Sarah did not ask me that can be done. But there is no sign that the Allied military forces are going to go to Ukraine. Now, we may regret that, and I certainly do, and I'm involved in efforts to try and change that decision. But be that as it may, with that in mind, it is essential to flood Ukraine with weapons, particularly air defense, electronic warfare capabilities to negate the Russian air and missile attacks, and to make it clear to Mr. Putin that under no circumstances can he win this war. Because only then, combined with the economic pressure and the domestic unrest that we already see in Russia, is there a chance of throwing him off his game, not to mention out of power. Because you have to understand that by invading Ukraine, Putin bet the farm. He has put the stability of Russia at risk. And any sound Western strategy needs to magnify that risk and to ensure that deterrence takes place. In other words, that if he makes nuclear threats, then we say back to him, if you want to make nuclear threats, just remember we have as many nukes as you do. And if you do use them, it'll be the last war you ever start. Unfortunately, we need to talk to them in that kind of language. As my classmate on this program knows, we're from Brooklyn, and I was a street kid in Brooklyn before I became a professor. And you don't take nonsense like that. That does not mean that we are expecting a nuclear attack. It's very unlikely, but we should not let him get away with these kind of threats. So what can be done? As I said, a no-fly zone would be an ideal situation, but there is a risk. We have to understand that risk. And the Biden administration, and that means NATO, will not do it. There are other things we can do. As I said, weapons have to be provided in bulk, and I already outlined the kinds of weapons that need to be given. I would also take a page from American history and go back to Franklin Roosevelt's Lend-Lease. Those of you who have studied American history will know in 1940-41, Roosevelt came up with the idea of Lend-Lease, first to aid Great Britain, but then to aid the Soviet Union in the war against Hitler. Originally, it was a deal with the Brits for, we would send them destroyers that we no longer needed. They would give us bases in the Caribbean so that we could repel the Nazi threat to South America, which alarmed Washington in those days, and which was considerable. But by 1941, once Hitler invades, it's become a full-scale program of supply. So, for example, to give you a sense of what the Russian army literally existed on Lend-Lease rations in World War II. And also the mechanization, that is or motorization, the conversion of the Russian army, the Soviet army in World War II to motorized warfare using cars, jeeps, trucks, tanks, etc., was very much facilitated by Lend-Lease. Indeed, the Russian word for jeep is Willis, because the Chalmers Willis or something like that was the main American Jeep company in World War II. We can do Lend-Lease for Ukraine. It would also relieve the naval pressure in the south and the threat of amphibious operations or the closure of the Black Sea. They could lend us bases in the Black Sea in return for ships. The ships would be obviously there to defend the Ukrainian coast or to frustrate the increasing amphibious operations that Moscow is undertaking. The Lend-Lease should be, however, I think priority air defense, electronic warfare, things like that. We should be sharing real-time intelligence with Ukrainians about Russian flights and troop movements and so on. Now, energy. Look, there's no way around it. Energy prices are going to rise for two reasons. One, Russia is a major energy player. Two, the growing demand worldwide as we come out of the pandemic. If you're going to take Russian energy off the market, as we should, you're going to have to find substitutes, and the standard of living is going to have to go down. I've written that not only do we need to find replacements for Russian energy from, say, the United States, the Middle East, Africa, South America, as well as existing suppliers like Norway, and even in East Asia, say Indonesia. We need to invest a lot more, and not only because of this war, but in general, we need to invest a lot more in alternative sources of energy. You may have heard of the IPCC report from the UN about climate change, which painted a very grim picture of what awaits us if we don't do this. So we may have to make sacrifices now in order to do that, but also for sound geopolitical reasons to bring the Russian economy to its knees, because that's the only language that Putin will understand. We are still importing Russian oil. Europe is still importing Russian oil and gas. That has to stop. Nord Stream 2's termination by the Germans was an act that was quite unexpected, and Germany has behaved probably too late, but now splendidly, doing things we've been asking or urging for years. But more needs to be done to stop the Russian war machine. Finally, about Israel and Iran. I am not up to speed on the terms of the negotiations in Vienna about a new JCPOA with Iran, so I can't speak to the terms of that. But whatever comes out of those negotiations will in some measure be connected to what we are now seeing in this war. And it is clear to everyone who studies it that Russia and China are both looking to be partners with Iran to a greater or lesser degree. Russia has resumed arms sales to Iran, for example, and that a Russian victory here will embolden Iran, and that a Russian defeat will have a sobering effect on Iran. And I think we can end there and now go to questions.
Thank you so much. That was so comprehensive and absolutely right on time. You did mention one thing that I wanted you to clarify further, and you said we might be able to de-escalate the ladder that Russia has embarked upon about the use of nuclear weapons. How do we do that?
Okay, the term escalation ladder is it's a kind of state-of-the-art term among people who study nuclear issues and strategy. That there's a ladder you go up. The late Herman Kahn was famous for this. There's a ladder of steps that governments take in a crisis, ranging from the very inception of crisis all the way up to the actual release of nuclear weapons or, God forbid, nuclear war. So Russia wants to dominate that ladder. That way it retains the strategic initiative. We have to find ways to take that initiative away from Moscow without triggering a nuclear war. One of them would be to say, okay, you want to make nuclear threats? Fine, go ahead, make my day. We have nuclear weapons also, and we're prepared to use them. And as a matter of fact, if you are so brazen as to use nukes, whether these are the low yield, that is lower than, say, 1 kiloton, or tactical nuclear weapons, which are basically shorter range nuclear weapons that are in the possession of the Russian Army and Navy, and maybe the Air Force as well. If you use those, either in Ukraine or elsewhere, the retaliation will be swift, certain, and decisive, and it will be the last thing you ever do. That language, without losing it, without becoming hysterical, that language will be decisive in stopping this aspect, at least, of the war. Now, if you do all the other things, it also may bring the war to an end. What we have to understand is that Putin and his foreign minister and ambassadors and all are going around saying we're going to fight on till the end until, and we're going to win.
Okay. All
And
right,
what
all right. Okay,
and
so
what winning
I
means
just,
is, yeah.
yeah, I just got a question. I can't believe you're advocating nuclear war over Ukraine. I don't think
I
that's what
didn't say
you're
that. I'm
saying.
not
You're
advocating
not
nuclear
saying
war
that.
anywhere.
Right, right,
I'm advocating real deterrence.
right, right, right.
The
I think,
point is, once nuclear weapons are used, you're in nuclear war. Now, what I'm saying is that we need a more robust deterrence. All we need to do is say to Mr. Putin, "You want to use nuclear weapons? We have them too, and if you use them, it'll be the last thing you ever do."
right,
That's not starting nuclear war. And people have to learn to think more seriously and less sort of off the cuff about these things. I mean,
right,
it's a
right.
terrible thing to contemplate. But the point is, this guy feels regularly that he can go along and threaten this. And what's more, every military exercise the Russian military does,
Right.
conventional weapons, is accompanied by a nuclear exercise.
Mhm.
And they are deploying, particularly in the Arctic, naval
Mhm.
nuclear weapons targeted on the United States.
Right.
Sarah and I live outside Washington, D.C. We're target A.
Right, right. All right, okay. You wouldn't believe some of the things that were flashing across our screen. I know
I
Steve
believe
very well.
anything.
He is definitely not a neocon. Okay, you were just
Absolutely not.
Absolutely not.
Never
Okay,
was.
and now I'm going to turn this over to my wonderful colleague, Hussein Abubakar Mansour, who will read the questions that have come in. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you very much, Stephen, for such a timely presentation. And thank you for all our audience who tuned in for this webinar. We've received a lot of questions. I'm not sure that we'll have the time to go through all of them, but I will do my best. And sometimes I'll combine several questions. One of the recurring questions that we actually got several times is, why aren't the Ukrainians bombing the Russian convoy, the 40-mile convoy outside of Kiev? Why are they just sitting there waiting for them to come in?
Well, first of all, they started bombing it last night. That was in today's news. So your questioner may have missed that. Second, I think the reason was they're trying to husband their air resources, because the minute you put up airplanes to start bombing it, that triggers electronic interference and attacks from Russian planes, and Ukraine cannot afford to lose planes. So they have to be very careful about when and how they attack. But from what I understand, they struck at that convoy today. So that's the up-to-date news. Now, let me just add here. I am not advocating a war over Ukraine. And indeed, we are, let me remind you, Mr. Putin has started a war over Ukraine, and he's also at war with the West. What I am advocating is robust deterrence to terminate the war in Ukraine on terms favorable to Ukraine and the West. And that means making it clear to Mr. Putin that he can't win. I am by no means a warmonger. And it would be helpful to people if they actually thought about these issues a little more rigorously and seriously, instead of going off and calling people they disagree with names. That's not going to advance understanding in any way. Go ahead.
Thank you, Stephen. All right, since you spoke about the response to what Putin's doing, we actually received multiple questions asking you to comment on the Biden administration's response so far. What do you think of the current status of the Biden administration? How do you find it?
I find the response to be very good. I don't think it's been enough, but it's also because Biden's first concern is to keep the alliance together, because the alliance is our source of strength. And that means that a lot of things they have to coordinate with the allies before they can do it. What has been pleasantly surprising, if you can call it that here, is that some of the allies have got out in front of the United States. And even non-allied states, well, Sweden, I mean, is not an ally, formally speaking, but Sweden, Finland, I think Poland, Slovakia, Germany, Great Britain are all sending weapons to Ukraine. The German sanctions are tough. Nord Stream 2 went like that. And the Biden team is very good. Well, now, also, I see, we need to offer Putin off-ramps. Putin has been offered off-ramps. There is no off-ramp for Mr. Putin, in my view. I mean, I could be wrong, but I don't believe that Putin has an off-ramp except victory or death, literally, because he has bet his political stakes on winning here. He cannot come back to the Russian people and say, you know, we started this war and we had to settle for less than what we wanted. And it's not going to play in Moscow. Now, I realize that, you know, people say, well, we're putting Putin in a corner. Putin put himself in a corner. You know, we have to understand we're dealing with a guy who's, and I don't want to get into a clinical discussion here, but it's very clear from everything he has ever said and done, even before this war, that he has an obsession about Ukraine and is now furious that they denied him a quick victory, which he expected. That much is clear without getting into the state of his health or his mental health or whatever. As a result, he is foreclosing options. I mean, when Macron called him up today and spoke to him, Putin said, we're going to go on and win. He's not interested in an off-ramp. He's not interested in a diplomatic solution. So I don't know how you give this kind of man off-ramp. Russia, and remember, I told you, you need to look at Russia the way Russians look at themselves. Offering him off-ramps is taken in Moscow as a sign, one, of weakness, and two, of duplicity.
Right.
What's their real game? They do not believe that the West can be relied on or trusted, and therefore they have to be beaten. That's a terrible analogy to draw. But again, if you understand the way those people in the elite now are watching this thing and thinking about it, that's it. Having, you know, they are like a Shakespearean villain. You know, when Macbeth said, I am in blood so far steeped that to go back would be as tedious as to go, or it's Putin. He can't go back and stop killing people and turn to the Russian people and say, well, sorry, guys, I made a mistake. So, yeah.
We received multiple questions, as you may imagine, on Israel. How can Israel maintain her position between standing up for Ukraine without alienating Putin and Russia, with all the complications that we know with Syria and Iran? And there was actually another question that's related to this. Does the Ukrainian president actually think that Israel can help, and why does he think so?
Well, let me start with the second question. Yes, he does. He asked Israel to mediate. That's why Bennett is calling Putin. As for the state of Israel, I understand their strategic position perfectly well. They are afraid that if Russia turns hostile, they will not be able to attack Iranian positions in Syria with impunity. And that's the great danger that was always here by us letting the Russians into Syria. I wrote this 8 years ago in Israel Journal of Foreign Relations, that essentially Russia now had a leverage on the Israeli air defenses and air capabilities. So I understand where Israel is, and I think they have made a difficult but more or less correct choice in their, it's disappointing, but it's also, I think, realistic. It's connected to prior American failures with regard to Syria in the Obama administration. So it is necessary to look at this in a sober way and say to them that they need to continue to provide discrete support to Ukraine. They could probably increase that support up to a certain point, but there are limits beyond which they cannot go to antagonize Russia. And that's unfortunate, but true.
Thank you. How does this affect China's calculations about Taiwan?
That's a good question. You know, when you try to answer that, we have to resort to some speculation because the Chinese are not talking. But I think it restrains them on Taiwan, because the Taiwanese will fight, and a Taiwan military operation is much more difficult than Ukraine because it's amphibious. That means that they will encounter much stronger resistance, and they have to do much more to be able to guarantee that they can overwhelm not just Taiwan, but the United States. And they too cannot afford a protracted war. So, I think is clear is making some people in Beijing very nervous as to what kind of ally they have bought themselves. Because Ukraine and China had excellent relations. China's actually said it would be willing to mediate this thing, which did not play well in Moscow. And they have abstained on UN resolutions, which also certainly did not go down well in Moscow. So on the one hand, they support Moscow. Their press supports Moscow. They've made economic deals with Russia. But I think this makes them take a second look on Taiwan, holds them back.
We've received multiple questions on the issue of sanctions, so I'm going to try to kind of combine all of them and reword them. So basically, sanctions are primarily most effective as a long-term strategy, not as a short-term strategy. Now, it seems that we're employing sanctions as a short-term strategy, and that's not really adequate against the military strategy of Russia and Ukraine. How do you view this? If the Russian invasion to Ukraine is successful, are the sanctions going to remain in place? Are the sanctions going to, be dropped?
Okay.
Yeah.
There are two questions here. First of all, sanctions are part of a broader strategy if they're going to be really as successful as they are intended to be. And that broader strategy, as I said, is part of what the U.S. military calls the dime. It's part of the economic piece of the puzzle. For 8 years, all we've done about Russia is sanctions. Because we don't want to get involved, or Obama didn't think it was that big an issue, quite wrongly. Third, the Allies didn't want to get involved. I mean, everybody should remember what we were going through trying to get Germany to sanction Nord Stream 2 up until the invasion. And we're still buying oil from Russia as we speak here today. Therefore, sanctions are not going to be enough to dissuade Putin from his course of action or to bring about a fundamental strategic change. They can only be part of a larger design. And that design, given the self-imposed constraints we're working on, one, Allied unity. Two, Biden doesn't want to go to war. The American people certainly are not in favor of this because they've not been told the stakes involved. And because of our follies in Iraq and Afghanistan. So that leaves you with fewer options. Sanctions have to be driven up to a point where they bring the economy to its knees. And second, the weapons flow to Ukraine has to be enhanced and perpetuated for a long time. And third, Russia's diplomatic isolation must be intensified. As I said, the only way you're going to get Putin to stop is by making it clear that he cannot win. And that's going to require giving the Ukrainians the tools, because this guy will not respond to anything but force. I'm not happy about this, but it's also the result of our prior neglect of what needed to be done. For those of you in the audience, there's who might know this, there's a famous Talmudic phrase that when dealing with the question of a guard who is negligent and lets people steal whatever he's entrusted in guarding, in that he is then obligated to pay back what was stolen plus. And to translate this into English, it's if you begin by negligence, you end up acting under compulsion. And right now we are acting under compulsion. We are the ones who are reacting. It is necessary, as I suggested before, for us to be putting Putin on the back foot and make him react. And to have him be more afraid of the United States than the United States is afraid of him. Right before this session, I heard a Ukrainian woman crying out to CNN, if 90 states can't get Putin to stop, there's something fundamentally wrong with the world. And she's right. So, next question.
Thank you. Well, we received also a number of questions about the grab of power of Putin. Is what's going on, or will what's going on, affect Putin's position? Are there any other groups in Russia, the oligarchs and so on, the generals, who might be contemplating replacing Putin?
First of all, if there's anybody who's thinking about replacing Putin, he's not telling us for very sound reasons. Second, this does affect his power. As I said, he bet the farm. He's wagered the stability of his system on victory. If he wins, he will have broken through any restraint imaginable. He will be a new Stalin, minus the Leninist ideology. Instead, you'll have classic reactionary Russian conservatism, which goes back to the 18th and 19th centuries, but a kind of Stalinism. And it's not accidental that this has been accompanied all the way with Putin's repressions at home growing steadily more draconian, and the revival of the Gulag in Russia over the last decade. These are two sides of a strategy. And the point I need to make here, that in Russian history, Russian autocracy and empire are two sides of the same coin. Whereas Great Britain and France, and if you want to argue the United States, certainly Germany, or Portugal and Spain, had empires, Russia is an empire. And its rulers think of it as such. This is the whole idea of the obsession, not too strong a word, with great power status and empire. That's what they're trying to bring back. If he succeeds, he's brought it back. If he fails, the whole system collapses. And then somebody will have to step in. Who that might be, I can't say, but it'll obviously be probably part of a coalition involving the instruments of force in Russia, because otherwise they won't be able to succeed at all. But that's what's at stake here. It's not just Ukraine. A Ukrainian victory means that Putin's system comes under enormous pressure, and it may be unsustainable after that. And we need to see that Ukraine wins.
Yep. Thank you. We've received also a number of questions, as you can imagine, on the Trump administration, and if at all the Trump's attitude that was friendly to Putin in Russia contributed to what's unfolding right now.
Yeah, because Trump gravely weakened the entire Atlantic alliance. I mean, Trump still admires Putin, thinks he's a genius. He weakened the alliance. He undermined American relations with Ukraine. And frankly, in my view, and for those who think I'm a neocon out there, this is a man who's unfit to be president, period. Should have been impeached, even on the Ukraine issue. Furthermore, he knew about Russian efforts to subvert our elections and couldn't care less. And what I'm saying, by the way, is what people who worked for him said. I mean, I know some of them, and this is what they told me as well. And it's what's written in the journalism and the history of the Trump administration. So it's not just me saying this. Now, there's no doubt that he contributed to Putin's view that the West is decadent, that even though the West is a threat, and this is a uniquely Russian view, even though the West is a threat, they are decadent, weak, corrupt, perverted, et cetera, et cetera. And we Russians, we are the true Christ-loving people, bearers of Christian values. And that they are trying to pollute us and corrupt us and so on. In many ways, if you've ever seen the movie Dr. Strangelove, General Jack the Ripper starts a nuclear war because the Russians are polluting our bodily essences by fluoridation and so on. This is the same kind of threat assessment. And it's written. It's not me saying this. It's them saying that that the West is coming for Russian natural resources and attempting to corrupt the country and so forth. This is all, of course, a dodge to keep Putin's power and wealth, about which he's obsessed, but it's no less felt for that.
We received questions about NATO. Is there any way that NATO would or can get involved without Russia invading a NATO country?
In theory, yes, but if Russia invades NATO and brings on a general European war, that's the end of the Russian state. And everybody in Russia understands that. Putin understands it as well. But the point is that Ukrainians don't want NATO troops. They want NATO support. What did Zelensky say? I need ammunition, not a ride. That ammunition needs to be coming in ceaselessly. What NATO needs to do is look after its own defenses, which are sadly in disrepair, because for years they neglected to defend the European border with Russia. If a NATO country was attacked today, NATO would have a great deal of difficulty getting out of Hamburg or Marseille to the front. And that's not just me saying it, because I'm in contact with military people who know what the logistic situation is in Central and Eastern Europe, and the fact that how many forces are there and so on. It's better than it was 8 years ago, but it's by no means enough. And those of us who've been arguing for enhanced conventional deterrence in Europe, so that Putin can't make nuclear threats, have only had limited success.
President Biden and Secretary Blinken threatened to seize Russian oligarchs' assets. Why are they threatening? Why aren't they just doing it?
Because we're a government of laws, unlike Russia. And private property is protected by law. That's one reason. Second, because these guys are smart and they have buried a lot of their assets under all kinds of third-party cutouts, shells corporations, or what have you. Yeah, members of your audience may remember that several years ago, we uncovered what was going on in Panama. Panama Mosback, I think is the name, is a law firm there, and that they were involved in shielding all kinds of oligarchs everywhere. Middle East, here, Europe, Russia, with money. Putin, one of Putin's buddies, who's a classical concert cellist, was shielding millions of dollars. And I mean, you can make a nice living in Russia playing the cello, but not that kind of money.
Thank you. We received questions about the future of Ukrainian resistance. If Russia's invasion is successful, are we expected to see a prolonged campaign of Ukrainian resistance, or is Russia going to overwhelm resistance and destroy it?
They don't have enough forces to overwhelm resistance. That's why this war was ill-conceived from the outset. When I worked for the military, we would get together and we'd have exercises or war games. If you want to go to war with somebody, you have to sit down and think really hard about what could go wrong. Putin didn't. As David Ignatius reported a while back, he apparently thought the Ukrainians would regard them as liberators. He made some mistakes not unlike those we made in Iraq. Didn't send in enough forces. They moved too slowly. Their coordination was terrible. The troops lacked basic logistic supplies. The logistic whole network was completely screwed up. Soldiers didn't know what their mission was. I mean, we're getting reports of soldiers surrendering and being without food or supplies or so on. This was completely mismanaged. But so as a result, they're now resorting to essentially the old-fashioned Russian campaign to blow the Ukraine apart. But as everybody's pointed out, you can you can occupy Kiev, Odessa, Kharkiv, or even Gerson. You won't be able to occupy them. And, again, Russia went through this in Afghanistan. They should have learned from our experience in Afghanistan and from Iraq. And it's a lot easier to go into war than to get out. And yet they bet the farm. This just shows how obsessive Putin is about Ukraine and how, I don't want to say detached, but unconnected he is to the real reality out there. He certainly did not expect the Western unified response. But he thinks he can just bull his way through, make the nuclear threats, and that eventually everybody will come to live with it and go back to business as usual. I doubt it.
All right, this will be the last question that we could ask. It's actually a question about timing. Why now? Why not a year ago? Why not 2 years ago? Why not 3 years ago when Trump was in office? Why did Putin decide on this specific timing?
First of all, as I said, he's obsessed with his mortality. He's going to be 70 in October. Second, the Ukrainians started getting more support from NATO member countries, leading him to think that NATO was coming in there in a backdoor kind of way. They launched investigations against pro-Russian buddies of his. They were getting stronger. Third, he saw the complete disarray of our retreat from Afghanistan. He saw what he believed to be the corruption of the West with regard to energy and ability to blackmail the West with energy in the winter. All those things come together, as well as the logic of his own domestic situation, because they are concerned about the elections that, I mean, they're not going to be real elections as you and I understand them, but they're going to be elections in 2024. So all these factors come together to do it now. Again, the personal, the imperial, and the strategic.
Thank you. Steve, this was really, really very illuminating. If anybody understands Putin's mindset and the whole cultural history of Russia and how they view the world and how they want to resurrect the Russian Empire, it is you. And I can't thank you enough. And I have to say again, for those that have joined late, while all eyes are gravitating towards Ukraine and the horrific humanitarian crisis and war that is going on there, we have gotten word out through a very courageous person who was a former high-ranking State Department official that the team in Vienna, led by Robert Malley, is about to have a deal with Iran as early as this coming Monday. It's imminent, and what they're about to offer are wholesale concessions. And if we have one power that is threatening us, that does not mean that we can take our eyes off the ball for another power that is threatening the national security interests of the United States, Israel, and our our Sunni allies in the Gulf. So please, if you have not gotten our press release or our action alert about it, please call 202-601-7422 and ask for it. If you have, and it is very imperative, we only have 4 days for Congress to react. So please call your member of Congress. If you do not know his phone number, you could reach it by calling the Capitol switchboard at 202-224-3121. Thank you very much, Steve. This was excellent. If you like what we do here in Emet, we ask that you please try to send us any shekels you possibly can to keep us alive, or dollars, at www.emetonline.org, so we can continue to present the public with excellent, excellent experts such as Dr. Stephen Blank. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sarah. I just want to say to people, if they have questions, Sarah has my email. I'm trying to answer questions that we didn't get into now. But if you want to get further the dialogue, Sarah has my email. Just ask her for it. I'll be happy to answer your questions as soon as I can. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Bye-bye.
Welcome.